January 15, 1945, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 28-year-old Dr. Lillian Mercer tears open an envelope with no return address and reads the first line. Doctor, I'm dying, but I must tell you, Caldwell murdered them all. Her hand trembles. She doesn't know the sender. She doesn't understand who he's talking about. But the handwriting, elderly, unsteady, as though the person wrote while fighting pain, compels her to keep reading. __, quote _1___. Lillian examines the postmark. The letter was mailed from Philadelphia on December 28th. Today is January 15th. She sets down the envelope and looks out the window of her office at Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital. Snow falls heavily, obscuring the view of the factory district beyond the iron fence that surrounds the hospital grounds. The red brick buildings of the industrial quarter stretch toward the Delaware River, smokestacks rising against the gray winter sky. Lillian has worked here for 2 years, since October 1943. She's a resident physician, 28 years old, born April 23, 1916, in Scranton to parents who owned a small pharmacy on Mulberry Street. Her father, Samuel Mercer, taught her to read medical texts when she was 10. Her mother, Ruth, died of influenza in 1918 when Lillian was 2. She has no memory of her. Samuel raised Lillian alone, encouraging her interest in medicine despite the obstacles facing women in the field. She attended the University of Pennsylvania, graduated in 1937, entered medical school at Temple University, one of 7 women in her class. She graduated in 1941, began her residency in internal medicine, then transferred to psychiatry in 1943 when a position opened at Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital. She chose psychiatry because she'd seen what the war was doing to young men, soldiers returning with shattered minds, nightmares they couldn't escape. She wanted to help them heal. In 1932, when Herman Tate was committed, Lillian was 16, living in Scranton, attending Central High School. She knew nothing about this hospital or anyone named Howard Caldwell. But the name sounds vaguely familiar. She feels she's heard it mentioned in passing, perhaps in the staff lounge, perhaps in conversation with older physicians who've worked here longer. Lillian stands, walks to the staff lounge, a narrow room with peeling green paint and a coffee pot that's always lukewarm. She finds an old medical directory from 1942 on a shelf beside outdated journals. She flips through it, searching. There, __, quote _2___. Lillian feels the skin on the back of her neck go cold. Superintendent, 11 years running this hospital, retired 6 years ago in 1939. He must be in his mid-70s now. She returns to her office, rereads the letter. __, quote _3___. Lillian doesn't believe it. She's a physician. She knows American psychiatry has its dark corners. She's read about the eugenics movement, forced sterilizations, the warehousing of patients in overcrowded asylums. But murder? Mass murder? It sounds like the ravings of a paranoid patient, the kind of delusional thinking she encounters daily. But Herman Tate writes, I was right. That means someone once refused to listen. That means he was dismissed, silenced, perhaps punished for speaking. Lillian thinks about the power dynamics in hospitals, how doctors are trusted implicitly, how patients' words are discounted as symptoms rather than testimony. She's seen it herself. A patient claims abuse by an orderly. The orderly denies it. The doctor sides with the staff. The patient's complaint is noted in the chart as __, quote _5__. Lillian decides to investigate. Not because she believes Herman Tate, not yet, but because she believes in thoroughness. If there's nothing to find, she'll know. If there's something, she'll face it. The next day, January 16th, Lillian descends to the hospital archives. The archives occupy the basement, reached by a narrow staircase that creaks under her weight. The basement is a windowless maze of corridors lined with file cabinets and wooden shelves stacked with boxes. It smells of dampness and old paper, mold and dust. A single bare bulb hangs from the ceiling in the main room. The archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, 63 years old, employed here since 1920, sits at a scarred wooden desk reading a newspaper. She looks up as Lillian enters, eyes suspicious behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Brennan is thin, gray-haired, dressed in a worn brown cardigan and long skirt. She's worked in this basement for 25 years, knows every file, every patient, every secret this hospital holds. "Can I help you, Dr. Mercer?" she asks, her voice cool. Lillian says, "I need a medical record. Herman Tate, presumably treated here in the early 30s. Mrs. Brennan's expression doesn't change, but something flickers in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. She nods, stands, disappears into the rows of shelves. Lillian waits, looking around. The archives are meticulously organized, metal file cabinets labeled by year, shelves holding bound ledgers with patient logs. Everything is cataloged, indexed, preserved. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Brennan returns with a worn manila folder, the edges frayed, the paper inside yellowed. 1932, July through September, she says, handing it to Lillian. Lillian thanks her, sits at the desk, opens the folder. Case file number 4427. Patient: Herman Tate, 39 years old, mechanical engineer, married, 2 children. Diagnosis: paranoid psychosis with persecutory delusions. Admission date: July 27, 1932. Referring source: referral from Midvale Steel Company physician, Dr. Walter Gaines. Complaint from wife regarding erratic behavior. Lillian reads the case history, written in neat handwriting she recognizes as belonging to intake clerks trained in medical transcription. Herman claimed embezzlement was occurring at the Midvale Steel Plant in South Philadelphia, that the chief engineer, Victor Hartley, and plant manager, Peter Stillwell, were falsifying production records and selling copper and brass to black market middlemen, pocketing the difference. Herman worked in the quality control department. His job was to verify that materials met specifications. He noticed discrepancies. Copper shipments recorded in ledgers that never arrived in the warehouse, brass fittings invoiced but not manufactured. He began keeping his own records, photographing documents after hours. He filed complaints with plant management. They dismissed him. He went to the union. The union told him to drop it. He went to the district attorney's office, filed a formal complaint on June 15, 1932. 2 weeks later, trouble began. Herman's wife, Nina Tate, 36 years old, filed a complaint with their family doctor on July 1, 1932. The doctor's note attached to the file describes Herman as ___quote__9___. On July 27th, Herman was committed to Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital under a court order signed by Judge Rufus Corbett of the County Court of Common Pleas. The commitment order cites __quote__10__. Attending physician, Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell, Superintendent. Lillian continues reading. Treatment plan: chloral hydrate 500 milligrams nightly for sedation. Hyoscine hydrobromide 0.6 milligrams 3 times daily. Insulin shock therapy initiated August 3rd. Lillian frowns. Insulin coma therapy in 1932 was relatively new. Introduced in 1927 by Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sakel, it involved injecting patients with large doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemic coma. The theory was that the shock would __quote_11__ disordered brain function. In practice, it was dangerous, sometimes fatal. Doses listed in Herman's chart are high. 30 units of insulin, increased to 50 units by mid-August. Notes in the observation log are sparse, written in the same hand throughout. Caldwell's. On September 23rd, an entry reads, ___quote__16___. Attached is a handwritten statement signed by Herman Tate. __quote _17__. The signature is shaky, almost illegible. Lillian closes the folder, sits back. On the surface, nothing criminal. A man made accusations, was deemed mentally ill, was treated, recanted, was released. A typical case for that era, when psychiatric diagnosis was often subjective and commitment procedures were loose. But something feels wrong. The timeline is too neat. Complaint filed June 15th, committed July 27th, 6 weeks later. The aggressive treatment, high-dose insulin, daily sessions, the forced recantation. And Herman wrote to her 13 years later, still insisting he was right. That means he survived, recovered, remembered. That means he never truly believed his accusations were false. He signed the statement to gain release, then spent 13 years trying to tell someone the truth. Lillian returns the folder to Mrs. Brennan and asks, __quote _18__. Mrs. Brennan stares at her for a long moment. The basement is silent except for the drip of water from a pipe somewhere in the darkness. Mrs. Brennan finally says, Lillian nods. Mrs. Brennan's face tightens. She sets down her pen, folds her hands. Why do you need this, Dr. Mercer? Lillian doesn't know what to say. She could lie, invent a research project, claim she's studying treatment outcomes. But something in Mrs. Brennan's expression stops her. A look of recognition, as though she's been waiting for this question for years. Lillian tells the truth. I received a letter from a former patient, Herman Tate. He claims Dr. Caldwell murdered people. I'm trying to determine if there's any basis for the claim. Mrs. Brennan goes pale. She stands abruptly, walks to the door, looks out into the hallway. Seeing no one, she closes the door, returns to the desk. She sits down heavily, pulls out a handkerchief from her cardigan pocket, wipes her forehead. Then she speaks quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew. I always knew. But I was afraid to say anything. Lillian feels her heart beat faster. What did you know? Mrs. Brennan looks away, staring at the file cabinets as though seeing through them into the past. There were patients brought in at night, late, after 10 o'clock, sometimes after midnight. No paperwork, no referral letters, no family members. Just two men in dark coats, sometimes police officers, sometimes men I didn't recognize. They'd bring someone, a man or woman, sometimes struggling, sometimes drugged into docility. They were placed in a separate ward on the 3rd floor, Ward C, always kept locked. Only Dr. Caldwell had the key. He treated them himself. He didn't assign them to other physicians. He didn't allow nurses or orderlies into the ward except under his direct supervision. He administered their medications personally, conducted their therapy sessions alone. After a month or two, they were either transferred to a state asylum, places like Penhurst, Byberry, or they were taken to the morgue. I saw the death certificates. Cause of death, always acute cardiac failure or pulmonary embolism. Natural causes. But there were too many. I counted. Over 11 years, from 1928 to 1939, 23 people. Lillian writes down, 23. Her hand is shaking. Mrs. Brennan continues, I asked Dr. Caldwell once. It was in 1933, I think. A young woman had died, Catherine somebody, I don't remember her last name. She'd been in Ward C for 2 months. I'd seen her once when Dr. Caldwell had me retrieve a file from the ward office. She was in her 20s, pretty, terrified. She grabbed my arm, begged me to help her, said she wasn't sick, said they'd locked her up to keep her quiet. I didn't know what to do. A week later, she was dead. I went to Dr. Caldwell, asked him what happened. He looked at me. I'll never forget that look, cold, like he was deciding something. And he said, Mrs. Brennan, these individuals are dangerous to society. We're treating them under a special program, coordinated with government agencies for the public good. You must not ask questions. Your job is to maintain the files, not to question medical decisions. If you cannot accept that, perhaps you should seek employment elsewhere. I was frightened. I had a husband, 2 children. Jobs were scarce. This was the Depression. I couldn't afford to lose my position. So I stopped asking. I kept my head down. I filed the death certificates, cataloged the records, and I tried to forget. But I never forgot. I see their names every day in these files. Lillian asks, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Do you have a list of those 23? Mrs. Brennan shakes her head. No, I never wrote it down. Too dangerous. But I can find them. I remember most of the names. Give me a week. I'll pull the files. Lillian agrees. 1 week. And Mrs. Brennan, thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy. Mrs. Brennan looks at her, eyes wet. I've waited 25 years for someone to ask. I'm glad it's you. Lillian leaves the archives, climbs the stairs back to the main floor. Her mind is racing. 23 deaths. A locked ward. A superintendent who operated in secrecy. Patients brought in by unidentified men. Government agencies. A special program. It fits the pattern Herman Tate described. Political persecution masked as psychiatric treatment. But she needs more than Mrs. Brennan's testimony. She needs the files, the evidence, the proof. She returns to her office, sits at her desk, stares out the window. Snow is still falling. She thinks, if this is true, if Caldwell really did murder 23 people, then this hospital, this place where she works, where she's supposed to heal people, was used as an instrument of state violence. And everyone who worked here, everyone who saw something and said nothing, was complicit, including Mrs. Brennan. Including, perhaps, physicians still employed here, still practicing. Lillian feels sick. That night, Lillian can't sleep. She lies in her small apartment on Spruce Street, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Herman Tate's letter. She gets up at 3 in the morning, makes coffee, sits at her kitchen table, rereads the letter by lamplight. I was right. She believes him now. She doesn't know why. She has no proof yet, but she believes him. She thinks about her father, Samuel, who died last year in 1944 of a heart attack at age 65. He taught her to question authority, to think critically, to never accept explanations just because they came from someone in power. Quote 34, he used to say. Quote 35. She wishes he were alive so she could ask his advice. But he's gone, and she's alone with this. On January 23rd, Mrs. Brennan brings Lillian a handwritten list on notebook paper, the kind schoolchildren use. 23 names, written in careful script. Admission dates and dates of death or transfer. Lillian reads, First, Kowalski Darlene, 41 years old, admitted March 3, 1930. Died April 27, 1930. Cause of death, acute cardiac failure. Second, Garrett Owen, 34 years old, admitted June 15, 1930. Transferred to Penhurst State School and Hospital August 21, 1930. Third, Langford Catherine, 28 years old, admitted October 1, 1931. Died December 8, 1931. Cause of death, pulmonary embolism. Lillian reads the entire list slowly, committing names to memory. The youngest, Catherine Langford, 28. The oldest, Barrett Ignatius, 57. All died or became permanently disabled within 2 to 4 months of admission. Patterns emerge. Most were in their 30s or 40s, working age. Several share occupations: printer, teacher, journalist, union organizer. One is listed as __quote_36___. Another as quote 37 __. Lillian asks Mrs. Brennan, quote 38 __. Mrs. Brennan hesitates. Lillian agrees. Over the next 2 weeks, Lillian spends every evening in the archives. She finishes her shift at 5, eats a quick dinner in the hospital cafeteria, then descends to the basement. Mrs. Brennan has cleared a space at a table in the corner, set up a desk lamp. Lillian reads 3 or 4 case files per night, taking detailed notes in a leather-bound journal she bought specifically for this purpose. She works methodically, carefully, aware that she's building a case, that every detail might matter. The pattern emerges clearly, undeniably. Patients admitted at night or late evening. No family members present. Referral source vague, often just a notation. By special services referral. County commissioner request. Federal investigation coordination. Diagnoses vague, interchangeable. Acute reactive psychosis. Paranoid state. Schizophreniform disorder. Attending physician always the same. Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell. Treatment aggressive, uniform. Massive doses of sedatives, insulin shock therapy, hydrotherapy carried to extremes. In several cases, electroshock therapy is noted. Another experimental treatment in the 1930s, often administered without anesthesia, causing broken bones, memory loss, terror. Notes in daily logs are identical across files, as though copied from a template. Condition grave. Patient remains uncooperative. Therapy continued. No improvements, no recoveries. Either death within weeks or transfer to custodial facilities. Death certificates all signed by the same physician, Dr. Caldwell. No autopsies performed. Bodies released to families or, in cases where no family claimed them, buried in the hospital cemetery. A small plot behind the main building marked with numbered stones. Lillian reads the case of Darlene Kowalski, the first victim on the list. Darlene was 41, a union organizer at Campbell Soup Company in Camden, New Jersey. Admission note. Patient brought in by request of Camden Police Department. Diagnosed with paranoid psychosis following increasingly erratic behavior at workplace. Patient claims employer is engaging in illegal labor practices, refuses to accept reassurance from family and authorities. Treatment: chloral hydrate, insulin shock. Death: April 27, 1930, 55 days after admission. Cause: acute cardiac failure. No autopsy. Body released to family. Lillian writes in her journal. Union organizer. Claimed employer breaking law. Dead less than 2 months after commitment. She reads the case of Owen Garrett, the printer. Owen was 34, employed at a printing shop on Market Street. Admission note. Patient brought in following arrest for trespassing on employer's property. Charges dropped on condition of psychiatric evaluation. Patient diagnosed with paranoid state. Claims employer is violating labor agreements. Patient has history of union activity. Treatment: hyoscine, insulin shock, electroshock. Transfer: August 21, 1930, to Penhurst State School and Hospital. Final note. Patient now catatonic, unable to speak or care for self, requires custodial care. Lillian writes, union activist, became catatonic after treatment, transferred to asylum. She reads the case of Catherine Langford, the teacher Mrs. Brennan mentioned. Catherine was 28, taught at a public school in Kensington, wrote articles for labor newspapers. Admission note. Patient brought in by court order following publication of libelous material regarding local business owners. Patient diagnosed with schizophreniform disorder, exhibits delusional beliefs about child labor practices in textile industry. Treatment: insulin shock, electroshock, hydrotherapy. Death: December 8, 1931, 68 days after admission. Cause: pulmonary embolism. No autopsy. Body released to family. Lillian writes, Journalist. Wrote about child labor. Dead 2 months after commitment. By February 7th, Lillian has finished reviewing all 23 files. She sits in the archive, hands shaking, staring at her journal. The picture is clear. These weren't psychiatric patients. They were political dissidents, labor organizers, whistleblowers, journalists, people who threatened powerful interests. Dr. Caldwell was the instrument used to silence them. But who ordered it? Who coordinated? She makes a list of common elements. 12 of the 23 were union activists or organizers. 5 worked in defense plants or war-related industries. Even in the early 1930s, before the current war, there were labor disputes in industries producing steel, munitions, ships. 3 were journalists or writers. 2 were lawyers who'd represented unions or workers in compensation cases. 1 was a postal inspector. Lillian finds this particularly interesting. Wonders what he was investigating. All had filed complaints, published articles, testified before government bodies, or otherwise made themselves inconvenient to someone with power. Lillian realizes this was systematic. Someone in government, or connected to government and industry, used the hospital to eliminate troublesome individuals. Psychiatric commitment was the perfect weapon. No trial, no jury, no public scrutiny. A judge signs an order based on a doctor's recommendation. The person disappears into an institution. Family members are told it's for the patient's own good. If the patient dies, it's attributed to natural causes or the severity of their illness. No one questions it. No one investigates. The system protects itself. She needs proof beyond the case files. She needs witnesses, people who can testify to what happened, who can connect the dots between the victims and the powerful people who wanted them silenced. She thinks of Herman Tate. He's dying, but maybe he can tell her more. The letter had no return address, but it was postmarked from Philadelphia. She checks the city directory at the public library. She goes there on February 8th during her lunch hour. Herman Tate, engineer, listed at 1847 Dauphin Street. Lillian writes down the address. That Saturday, February 10th, she takes the streetcar north. The streetcar rattles along Broad Street, then turns east. Lillian watches the city pass by, shops, churches, rows of houses. It's cold, the sky overcast. She gets off at Dauphin Street, walks 3 blocks east. The neighborhood is working class, tidy. Row houses with narrow stoops, small front yards, some with American flags hanging limp in the still air. Number 1847 is at the end of the block, a 2-story brick house with white trim. Lillian climbs the steps, knocks. A woman in her early 30s opens the door, thin, dark-haired, wearing a simple house dress and apron. She looks at Lillian with curiosity and something else. Hope? "Can I help you?" she asks. Lillian says, "I'm Dr. Lillian Mercer. I'm looking for Herman Tate." The woman's face changes. Her eyes widen. Her hand goes to her mouth. "Quote 56, she says, her voice breaking. Lillian nods. The woman opens the door wider, steps aside. Quote 57. Inside, the house is modest but clean. Family photographs on the walls, wedding pictures, children's school portraits, a photo of a young man in army uniform. Alma sees Lillian looking at it. "My brother Eddie, he's in France. We pray for him every night." Lillian nods. Alma leads her upstairs, down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom at the back of the house. The room is dim, curtains drawn. Herman lies in a narrow bed covered with quilts. He's thin, painfully thin, gray-haired, his face gaunt. He's 52 years old but looks 70. An oxygen tank stands beside the bed, a tube running to his nose. He's breathing with difficulty, each breath a struggle. He sees Lillian and his eyes, still sharp, still aware, light up. Quote 59, he whispers. Lillian sits in the chair beside the bed. Herman closes his eyes. A tear runs down his cheek, disappears into the pillow. His voice breaks. Alma, standing in the doorway, wipes her eyes with her apron. Lillian takes Herman's hand. It's cold, the skin papery. Quote, 63, she says gently. Herman speaks slowly, pausing frequently to catch his breath. Alma brings him water, holds the glass to his lips. He drinks, continues. Quote, 64. He pauses, breathing hard, continues. Quote, 65. Herman's breathing becomes labored. Alma says, Dad, maybe you should rest. Herman shakes his head. No, I need to tell her. He looks at Lillian. 2 weeks later, 2 men came to my house. Evening, about 8 o'clock. They said they were from the Department of Health. They had badges, looked official. They said there'd been a complaint about my mental health, that I needed to be evaluated. I said, who complained? They wouldn't say. I refused to go with them. They left. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Next day they came back, this time with police. They had a court order, signed by a judge, Judge Corbett. Said I was a danger to myself and others, needed immediate psychiatric evaluation. They dragged me out of my house in front of my wife, my kids, my neighbors. Nina, my wife, she was crying, asking what was happening. They wouldn't tell her. They put me in a car, took me to Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital. Dr. Caldwell examined me. 5 minutes. He asked if I believed people were stealing from Midvale Steel. I said yes, I had proof. He wrote in his notes. Then he said, Mr. Tate, you're suffering from paranoid delusions. You need treatment. I said, I'm not delusional. I have documents. He said, your documents are fabrications created by your disordered mind. You'll be admitted for treatment. Herman stops, coughs. Alma wipes his mouth with a cloth. He continues. They put me in Ward C, 3rd floor, locked ward, small room, barred window. Every morning they injected me. Insulin. I didn't know what it was at first. After the injection, I'd start feeling strange, dizzy, sweating, heart racing. Then I'd black out. When I woke up, I couldn't remember my name, where I was, who I was. It was like my mind was erased. It went on every day. Some days I'd convulse, thrash around. They'd strap me down. I thought I was dying. I begged them to stop. They didn't stop. 8 weeks. Every day, insulin. By the end, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't remember why I was there. Caldwell would come, ask me, do you still believe people at Midvale are stealing? I didn't know. I couldn't remember. He'd say, you made false accusations because you were sick. Say it. Say you were wrong. Eventually, I said it. I said whatever he wanted. I just wanted it to stop. Herman's voice is barely audible now. __quote _71 __. Lillian says gently, Quote 72, Herman nods weakly. Quote 73, Lillian asks. Quote 74, Herman nods. Quote 75, Herman's breathing becomes very labored. Alma says firmly, Dad, that's enough. You need to rest. Herman grips Lillian's hand with surprising strength. Quote 77. Quote, he whispers. Quote 78. Quote, Lillian feels tears in her own eyes. Quote 79. Quote, Herman closes his eyes, releases her hand. His breathing slows. Lillian stands, follows Alma out of the room. Downstairs, Alma makes tea. They sit at the kitchen table. Alma says, Quote 80. Lillian says, Quote 81. Alma nods. Quote 82. Lillian spends the next week working cautiously. She can't go to the police, not yet. She doesn't know who to trust. If Judge Corbett was involved, if there was a network of powerful men using the hospital to silence dissidents, then going to the wrong person could get the investigation shut down, or worse, could get her committed. She's seen how easy it is. A complaint to a judge, a doctor's signature, and anyone can disappear. She needs an ally in the legal system, someone with integrity, someone who can't be bought. She thinks of someone. Cyrus Vaughn. She met him 2 years ago, in 1943, at a medical legal conference at the University of Pennsylvania. He's an assistant district attorney, 41 years old, reputation for honesty. He'd prosecuted several corruption cases, low-level officials, kickback schemes. Nothing as big as this, but he'd shown he wasn't afraid to challenge power. Lillian calls his office on March 7th, speaks to his secretary. She says she has information about criminal activity at a state hospital, needs to speak with him confidentially. The secretary says he'll call back. He does, that afternoon. They arrange to meet. They meet on March 9th at a small diner near City Hall, away from the courthouse. Vaughn is a tall man, lean, with graying hair and sharp eyes behind round spectacles. He orders coffee, listens as Lillian talks. She lays out everything: the letter from Herman Tate, the 23 case files, the pattern of political persecution, the locked ward, Mrs. Brennan's testimony, Herman's account. She shows him her notes, the list of names. Vaughn listens without interrupting. When she finishes, he sits back, is silent for a long moment. Then he says, __quote _83 __. Lillian nods. Vaughn continues. Lillian says, Vaughn nods. Lillian says, Vaughn says. Lillian spends the next 2 weeks photographing files. She borrows a camera from a colleague, tells him she's documenting unusual cases for a research project. Every evening she goes to the archives. Mrs. Brennan helps her, standing guard, warning her if anyone approaches. Lillian photographs each page carefully. Admission notes, daily logs, treatment plans, death certificates, commitment orders. 23 files, hundreds of pages. By March 23rd, she has everything. She develops the film at a pharmacy that offers the service, picks up the prints, thick envelopes of photographs, grainy but legible. She delivers them to Vaughn at his office after hours. Vaughn studies the photographs for a week. On March 30th, he calls Lillian. You're right. This is murder. Systematic, coordinated. The commitment orders all follow the same pattern. Vague allegations of mental illness, danger to self or others, signed by judges who had financial ties to the companies or industries the victims were challenging. The treatment records show deliberate overdosing, insulin levels that would induce coma or death, electroshock without proper protocols. And the death certificates are suspicious. No autopsies, causes of death too convenient. I'm ready to bring this to the district attorney. But I need a smoking gun. Someone alive who can testify that Dr. Caldwell acted on orders, that there was a conspiracy. Without that, defense attorneys will argue Caldwell was just a doctor using accepted treatments of his time, that the deaths were unfortunate but not criminal. Lillian says, Herman Tate. He can testify that he was committed for political reasons, that Caldwell told him his accusations were delusions, that the treatment was meant to break him. Vaughn says, get him to talk to me, as soon as possible. If he dies before giving a statement, we lose our strongest witness. Lillian returns to Dauphin Street on April 1st. Herman is worse, much worse. He's barely conscious, breathing with great difficulty even with the oxygen. The skin of his face is gray, sunken. Alma meets Lillian at the door, eyes red from crying. __quote _92 __. Lillian explains about Vaughn, about the need for a formal statement. Alma says, quote, 93, quote. Alma goes upstairs, returns a few minutes later. Quote, 94, quote. Lillian calls Vaughn from Alma's telephone. He arrives within the hour, carrying a stenographer's notebook. Upstairs, Herman is propped up on pillows, eyes half open. Vaughn introduces himself, explains that he's a prosecutor, that he's investigating Dr. Caldwell in the hospital. Herman nods weakly. Vaughn says, quote, Herman whispers, quote, over the next hour, with frequent pauses, Herman tells his story. Vaughn writes everything down in shorthand. The theft at Midvale Steel, the complaint to the DA, the men who came to his house, the commitment order, the insulin treatments, the forced recantation, Judge Corbett's name, the other patients he saw. When Herman finishes, Vaughn reads the statement back to him, asks if it's accurate. Herman says yes. Vaughn produces a notarized statement form, helps Herman sign it. Herman's signature is a shaky scrawl, barely legible, but it's his. Vaughn signs as witness. Alma signs. Lillian signs. The statement is legal. 3 days later, on April 4th, 1945, Herman Tate dies. Alma calls Lillian that evening. Lillian attends the funeral on April 7th. It's held at a small Catholic church in the neighborhood. Maybe 30 people attend. Family, friends, neighbors. The priest speaks about Herman's integrity, his courage, his love for his family. Alma reads a passage from Scripture. Eddie, Herman's son, is still in France. He can't come home. After the service, at the graveside, Alma tells Lillian, quote, Lillian says, quote, on April 10, 1945, District Attorney Lawrence Preston announces the formation of a grand jury to investigate. Quote, the announcement is brief, cautious, buried on page 12 of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Quote, the article mentions quote, _101 but gives no details. Lillian reads it over breakfast, feels a mix of relief and anxiety. The investigation is official now, but it's also public. Caldwell will know. Corbett will know. They'll lawyer up, fight back. This is just the beginning. The grand jury convenes on April 23, 1945, Lillian's 29th birthday. She spends the day at the hospital, working her regular shift, trying to act normal. Her colleagues notice nothing unusual. That evening, she receives a subpoena to testify on April 25th. She's not surprised. 2 days later, she enters the grand jury room, a wood-paneled chamber in the courthouse, 23 citizens seated at a long table. Cyrus Vaughn conducts the questioning. Lillian presents her findings calmly, methodically. She describes receiving Herman Tate's letter, her investigation in the archives, the pattern she found in the 23 case files. She presents photographs of key documents, admission notes, treatment records, death certificates. She describes her interviews with Herman Tate and Mrs. Brennan. She remains composed, factual, professional. The grand jurors listen, faces grim. Some take notes. One woman, elderly, wipes her eyes. On May 2nd, Mrs. Dorothy Brennan testifies. She describes her 25 years working in the hospital archives, the patients brought in at night, the locked ward, Dr. Caldwell's secrecy. She describes asking Caldwell about the deaths and his response, quote, she admits her own silence, her fear. She says, voice breaking. Vaughn asks her gently. She says, over the next week, family members testify. On May 7th, Irene Kowalski takes the stand. She's 29 years old, a seamstress, widow. Her husband was killed in North Africa in 1943. She has a young son who stays with a neighbor while she testifies. She describes her mother, Darlene, a union organizer at Campbell's Soup. My mother fought for fair wages, safe working conditions. She wasn't crazy. She was brave. They killed her for it. Irene shows the grand jury a photograph of her mother at a rally, holding a sign. That's who she was. They took her away and she never came home. On May 9th, Martin Langford testifies. He's 53, a postal clerk, married, 3 children. He describes his sister Catherine, a teacher and writer. Quote 109 __. On May 10th, Constance Garrett testifies. She's 56, thin, gray-haired, living with her sister. She describes her husband Owen, a printer and union organizer. Owen was a good man, honest, hardworking. He wanted fair pay for his shop. They destroyed him, turned him into a vegetable. He spent 11 years in an asylum before he died. He didn't recognize me, didn't know his own name. They did that to him. She looks directly at the grand jurors. Find the people who did this. Make them pay. On May 14th, the grand jury subpoenas Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell. He appears on May 16th, accompanied by 2 lawyers. He's 76 years old, tall, white-haired, still sharp-eyed and commanding. He wears an expensive suit, walks with a cane. He takes the oath, sits down. Vaughn begins questioning. Caldwell denies everything. Vaughn presses him. Vaughn. Questioning goes on for 6 hours. Caldwell doesn't break. He's been a physician for over 50 years, superintendent of a major hospital for 11. He knows how to present himself, how to deflect, how to appear reasonable. He admits nothing. On May 18th, the grand jury subpoenas Judge Rufus Corbett. He refuses to appear, citing judicial privilege. Vaughn files a motion to compel testimony. The case goes to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It takes 12 days for the court to rule. On May 30th, the Supreme Court issues its decision. Corbett must testify. Judicial privilege does not protect against criminal investigation. Corbett has no choice. He appears on June 4th. He's 67 years old, silver-haired, imperious. He's served on the county bench for 20 years, comes from a wealthy family, knows everyone who matters in Philadelphia. He's accompanied by 3 lawyers. He takes the oath reluctantly, sits down stiffly. Vaughn questions him. Corbett admits signing commitment orders, 11 of them, for patients on the list. Based on medical recommendations from Dr. Caldwell, I relied on his expertise. It's not my role to second-guess a physician's diagnosis. Judge Corbett, isn't it true that you own stock in Midvale Steel Company? I own stock in many companies. I'm a private investor. Isn't it true that Herman Tate filed a complaint with the district attorney alleging theft at Midvale Steel, and 2 weeks later you signed the order committing him to Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital? I don't recall the specific timing. Isn't it true that you signed commitment orders for 11 individuals who had filed complaints, published articles, or testified against companies in which you held financial interests? I signed orders based on medical necessity, not financial considerations. Isn't it true that you and Dr. Caldwell conspired to use psychiatric commitment as a weapon to silence political dissidents and protect corporate interests? Corbett, voice rising. That's an outrageous lie. I performed my judicial duties according to law. If you're suggesting I committed crimes, charge me. Otherwise, this is harassment. The questioning lasts 8 hours. Corbett remains defiant. But the evidence is there. The pattern of commitment orders, the financial ties, the timing. The grand jurors see it. On June 11, 1945, the grand jury issues its report. 23 counts of involuntary manslaughter against Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell. 11 counts of conspiracy to commit false imprisonment against Judge Rufus Corbett. The report describes a systematic scheme lasting over a decade to silence political dissidents, labor organizers, and whistleblowers through psychiatric incarceration and medical abuse, resulting in multiple deaths and permanent disabilities. The report names both defendants, summarizes the evidence, recommends prosecution. The Philadelphia Inquirer publishes the full report on June 12, 1945. Front page, above the fold, grand jury charges prominent doctor, judge in hospital death scandal. The article runs 3 full columns, includes photographs of Caldwell and Corbett, lists the names of the 23 victims. By evening, the story is picked up by national wire services. The next day, it's front-page news across the country. The New York Times, quote, 134. The Washington Post, quote, 135. Editorial boards call for accountability. Civil liberties groups issue statements demanding federal investigation. The American Civil Liberties Union announces it will monitor the case. On June 18, 1945, Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell is arrested at his home in Marion. He posts bail, $50,000, secured by his house and investments. He's released pending trial. Judge Rufus Corbett is not arrested. As a sitting judge, he cannot be taken into custody without impeachment proceedings. But the State Judicial Conduct Board meets in emergency session. On June 25th, they vote unanimously to suspend Corbett from the bench pending the outcome of the criminal case. Corbett issues a statement calling the charges politically motivated and vowing to fight them. Public reaction is intense. Protests outside the courthouse. Union members march carrying signs. Justice for Darlene Kowalski. Remember Owen Garrett. Catherine Langford spoke truth. Families of the victims give interviews to newspapers. Irene Kowalski tells a reporter, "My mother died because she fought for workers' rights. They silenced her. But we won't be silent anymore." The hospital where Lillian works becomes the focus of media attention. Reporters camp outside, trying to interview staff. The new superintendent issues a statement expressing deep regret for past practices and promising full cooperation with authorities. Lillian is contacted by dozens of reporters. She refuses most interviews, issues one brief statement. "I did what any physician should do. I investigated evidence of harm and reported it. The legal system will determine guilt. I hope this case brings justice to the victims and their families." Trial is set for October 15, 1945. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Howard Nathaniel Caldwell and Rufus Corbett, two defendants, tried together. The prosecution team is led by Cyrus Vaughn, with assistance from two senior prosecutors assigned by the Attorney General's office. This case is too important to risk losing. The defense. Caldwell hires a team from a prestigious Philadelphia firm, led by Marcus Whitfield, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the state. Corbett hires his own team, led by Jonathan Sterling, a former federal prosecutor. Both defense teams filed dozens of pretrial motions. Motions to dismiss, motions to sever the trials, motions to exclude evidence. All are denied. The trial will proceed. October 15, 1945. The courtroom is packed. Family members of victims sit in the gallery. Reporters fill the press section. Judge Arthur Holland presides. He's 62, appointed to the bench 15 years ago, known for fairness and no-nonsense rulings. Jury selection takes 3 days. Finally, on October 18th, opening statements begin. Vaughn speaks first. He lays out the prosecution's case methodically. 23 victims, a pattern of political persecution, abuse of psychiatric authority, conspiracy between a doctor and a judge to eliminate dissidents. He shows photographs of the victims, reads their names aloud. __quote_144___. Defense attorneys respond. Whitfield, representing Caldwell, argues that his client was a dedicated physician using accepted treatments of his era, that psychiatric medicine in the 1930s was primitive by today's standards, that unfortunate outcomes don't constitute criminal intent. Sterling, representing Corbett, argues that his client relied on medical advice, that judges must trust expert opinions, that there's no evidence of conspiracy. The battle lines are drawn. Lillian testifies on October 18th in the afternoon. She takes the stand, places her hand on the Bible, swears to tell the truth. Vaughn questions her. She describes receiving Herman Tate's letter, her investigation, the 23 case files, the patterns she found. She's cross-examined for 2 days, October 19th and 20th. Defense attorneys try to discredit her. Whitfield suggests she's a young, inexperienced physician seeking attention. Sterling tries a different approach, suggesting she's biased against authority figures. Dr. Mercer, isn't it true you've criticized hospital administrators in the past? I've raised concerns about patient care when warranted. Isn't it true you have a personal animus against Dr. Caldwell? I never met Dr. Caldwell before this investigation. Lillian remains calm, factual, doesn't rise to the bait. Other witnesses follow over the next week. Mrs. Brennan testifies on October 22nd, her voice steady despite her age. She describes the locked ward, the night admissions, Caldwell's threats. On cross-examination, defense attorneys suggest she's senile, confused, that her memory is unreliable. She responds firmly. __quote _155 __ Edith Grayson, the former nurse, testifies on October 24th. She describes what she saw on Ward C: patients restrained for days, insulin overdoses, electroshock without anesthesia. __quote _156 __ Family members testify on October 25th and 26th. Irene Kowalski, Martin Langford, Constance Garrett. Each tells their story. Each describes a loved one taken, destroyed, killed. On October 30th, the prosecution introduces Herman Tate's signed statement, taken 3 days before his death. Defense attorneys object strenuously. Hearsay, unreliable. The defendant is dead and cannot be cross-examined. Vaughn argues for admission under the dying declaration exception. Statements made by someone who knows they're dying are presumed truthful. Judge Holland allows it. The statement is read aloud to the jury. Herman's words, describing his commitment, his treatment, his forced recantation. The courtroom is silent. On November 5th, Dr. Caldwell takes the stand in his own defense. It's a calculated risk. Defendants don't have to testify, but Caldwell wants to present himself as a respectable physician, not a criminal. He speaks calmly, confidently. I dedicated my life to helping mentally ill patients. In the 1930s, we had limited tools: insulin therapy, electroshock, hydrotherapy. These were the best treatments available. I used them according to the standards of the time. Some patients improved, some didn't. That's the nature of medicine. Tragic outcomes are not crimes. Vaughn cross-examines him brutally. He confronts Caldwell with specific case files, specific dose records. Dr. Caldwell, this patient received 80 units of insulin, double the maximum recommended dose. Why? Caldwell, each patient is different. Dosing must be individualized. Vaughn, this patient died 3 days after receiving that dose. Cause of death? Cardiac failure. Don't you think the insulin caused the death? Caldwell, correlation is not causation. Vaughn, out of 23 patients in Ward C, 19 died or became permanently disabled. That's an 83% failure rate. Don't you find that unusual? Caldwell, these were severely ill patients. Poor outcomes were expected. Vaughn, isn't it true these patients weren't ill at all? That they were political dissidents you were paid to silence? Caldwell, voice rising. That's a lie. I treated patients based on medical need, nothing else. The cross-examination lasts 2 days. Caldwell deflects, rationalizes, blames others when pressed, but he never admits wrongdoing. On November 12th, Judge Corbett testifies. He's angry, defensive. He admits signing commitment orders, but insists he relied on medical advice. Vaughn confronts him with evidence of financial ties, stock ownership in companies the victims had challenged. Corbett insists it's coincidence. I own stock in dozens of companies. That doesn't mean I persecute their critics. Vaughn, isn't it true you met regularly with Dr. Caldwell during the years 1928 to 1939? Corbett, we were professional acquaintances. Vaughn, isn't it true you discussed specific individuals who were causing problems for your business interests? Corbett, no, that's a fantasy. Vaughn presents evidence, bank records showing payments from Corbett to Caldwell, $5,000 in 1932, another $5,000 in 1935. Corbett claims they were charitable donations to the hospital. Vaughn, charitable donations made in cash with no receipts? Corbett has no good answer. Closing arguments begin November 16th. Vaughn speaks for 3 hours, summarizing the evidence, connecting the dots. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power and its abuse. Dr. Caldwell and Judge Corbett used their positions to eliminate people they considered threats. Not threats to public safety, but threats to profit, to power, to privilege. They turned a hospital into a prison, medicine into a weapon, justice into a farce. 23 people died or had their lives destroyed. The evidence is overwhelming. Hold them accountable. Defense attorneys present their closings. Whitfield argues reasonable doubt. No direct evidence of conspiracy. No proof Caldwell intended to kill anyone. Sterling argues the same for Corbett. No proof he knew what Caldwell was doing. My client is a judge, not a doctor. He relied on medical expertise. That's not a crime. The jury receives the case on November 17th. They deliberate for 4 days. Lillian doesn't attend. She's back at work, trying to maintain normalcy, but she can't concentrate. On November 20th, word comes. The jury has reached a verdict. Lillian rushes to the courthouse. The courtroom is packed. The jury files in. The foreman, a postal worker named Thomas Riley, stands. Judge Holland asks, quote, 176. Riley, quote, 177. Verdict on Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell. Guilty on 19 counts of involuntary manslaughter, not guilty on 4. Verdict on Judge Rufus Corbett. Guilty on 8 counts of conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, not guilty on 3. The courtroom erupts. Family members weep, embrace. Reporters rush out to file stories. Caldwell sits motionless, face pale. Corbett shouts, quote, 178. Bailiffs restrain him. Judge Holland bangs his gavel, restores order. He thanks the jury, dismisses them. Sentencing is set for December 3rd. December 3rd, 1945. The courtroom is packed again. Judge Holland presides. He speaks directly to the defendants. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 179 underscore underscore. Caldwell, expressionless, is led away in handcuffs. Judge Holland turns to Corbett. Corbett, face red, shouts. Bailiffs drag Corbett out, still shouting. Outside, Lillian is surrounded by reporters. Flashbulbs pop, questions shouted. She says only, quote, 183, quote. She walks away, disappearing into the crowd. In the months after the trial, Lillian's life changes. She's invited to speak at medical conferences, to testify before congressional committees investigating abuses in state psychiatric hospitals. A congressional subcommittee holds hearings in early 1946, examining practices nationwide. Lillian testifies in February, describing the Caldwell case, urging reforms. The hearings result in proposed legislation, the Mental Health Systems Act of 1947, establishing stricter oversight of psychiatric facilities, patient rights protections, limits on involuntary commitments. Some provisions pass, some don't. Progress is slow, but it's progress. Lillian doesn't care about fame. She returns to her work at Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital, now under new management. The hospital's Board of Trustees issues a public apology, acknowledges past abuses, commits to reform. The third-floor Ward C is closed, converted to storage. A memorial plaque is installed in the main lobby, unveiled in a ceremony on June 12, 1946, 1 year after the grand jury report. The plaque is simple bronze, listing the names of the 23 victims in alphabetical order. Lillian helped design it. She wanted it visible, unavoidable, so no one who enters the hospital can forget. She visits it often, reads the names silently, remembers. Dr. Howard Nathaniel Caldwell serves 8 years of his sentence. He dies in Graterford Prison on March 14, 1953, age 84, of pneumonia. His death is noted in a brief obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 184 underscore underscore. No mention of his earlier career, his awards, his reputation. He's remembered only for his crimes. Judge Rufus Corbett is released from prison on August 20th, 1955, after serving 9 years with good behavior. He's 77 years old, disbarred, disgraced. He moves to Florida, lives quietly in a small apartment in St. Petersburg until his death on January 9th, 1962, age 84. He dies alone. No obituary is published. Lillian continues practicing medicine. She never marries. She's asked why once by a colleague. She says simply, "I never found the time." The truth is more complicated. She devoted herself to work, to patients, to justice. Personal life seems secondary. She's offered positions at prestigious hospitals, medical schools. She declines. She stays at Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital until 1960, when she transfers to a community clinic in North Philadelphia, working with poor families, immigrant communities. She works there until retirement in 1975, age 59. She retires not because she wants to, but because the clinic closes due to funding cuts. She volunteers after that, at free clinics, teaching first aid to neighborhood groups. On August 25, 1985, Lillian receives an invitation. Alma Tate, now 64 years old, invites her to a memorial service marking 40 years since Herman's death. Lillian attends. The service is held at Alma's home on Dauphin Street, the same house where Lillian met Herman in 1945. 10 people attend. Family, friends. Alma's children are grown now, have children of their own. Eddie, Herman's son, came home from the war in 1946, worked as a machinist, died in 1982. Alma speaks about her father. She raises a glass. They drink. Lillian sits quietly, gazes at Herman's photograph on the wall, black and white, old, him young, about 30, smiling. She thinks, he was 52 when he died. Too soon. Too early. Alma approaches, embraces Lillian. Thank you. Thank you for being who you are. Lillian doesn't know what to say. She simply embraces Alma in return. 1986. Lillian is 70 years old. She lives alone in a small apartment in West Philadelphia, 3 rooms on the second floor of a row house. She reads, walks, volunteers occasionally. She has few friends. Most people her age are dead or in nursing homes. She doesn't mind solitude. She's always been comfortable alone. Journalists still call sometimes, wanting to interview her about the Caldwell case. Historians researching psychiatric abuse. Students writing papers. She talks to them, tells the story again. She never tires of it. She considers it her duty, keeping the memory alive. One day in April 1986, a young woman knocks on her door. Lillian opens it. The woman is about 25, dark-haired, wearing jeans and a Temple University sweatshirt. Lillian remembers the letter vaguely. She receives many letters, she says. They sit in Lillian's small living room. Evelyn explains. Owen Garrett was my grandfather. I never met him. He died in 1981, before I was born. But my grandmother, Constance, she told me about him before she died. She said he was a good man, a printer, a union organizer. She said they destroyed him in a hospital, turned him into a vegetable. She said you were the one who exposed what happened, who got the people responsible convicted. I wanted to meet you, to say thank you. Because of you, I know the truth about my grandfather. I know he wasn't crazy. I know he was murdered for standing up for what was right. Lillian looks at this young woman, sees the resemblance, Owen's eyes perhaps, or his stubborn chin. She says, ___, quote _ 192 ___. Evelyn's eyes fill with tears. Thank you for remembering him. Lillian embraces her. She thinks, for moments like these, it was worth everything. Lillian Mercer dies on February 11, 2001, age 85. She suffers a stroke in her apartment, is found by a neighbor the next morning. She dies in the hospital. Pennsylvania Hospital, ironically, where she once worked as a medical student. She dies peacefully, without pain. Her funeral is held on February 15th at a small Episcopal church in West Philadelphia. Dozens attend, former colleagues, patients she treated over the years, family members of the 23 victims or their descendants. Alma Tate, now 80 years old, fragile but determined, attends. She delivers a brief eulogy. Dr. Mercer was a hero. She preserved the memory of our loved ones. She proved that one person, acting with courage and integrity, can change the world. She fought for justice when it was dangerous, when it would have been easier to stay silent. Thank you, Lillian, for everything you did. We will never forget you. Lillian is buried in West Laurel Hill Cemetery, in a modest plot she purchased years earlier. A simple granite headstone marks her grave. Inscription: Lillian Mercer, M.D., 1916 to 2001. Physician, advocate, person of conscience. But the true monument to Lillian is the memorial plaque in the lobby of what was once Eastern Pennsylvania State Hospital, now converted to administrative offices for the Department of Human Services. The plaque remains there still, polished bronze, the names still legible. Passers-by stop, read. In memory of 23 individuals who died or suffered irreparable harm at this institution, 1930 to 1939. Darlene Kowalski, Owen Garrett, Catherine Langford, and 20 more names. At the bottom, their truth was silenced, their memory endures. Thanks to the courage of Dr. Lillian Mercer, who refused to look away.